Good morning, everyone, and welcome to our free webinar for September. We're doing another HR Spotlight. For those who are new here, the HR Spotlight series focuses on different parts of HR so that we can really highlight the skills and the knowledge that are needed in those different functions. If you are not an HR professional, don't worry, you're welcome here because, as we say, HR function, HR tasks and responsibilities are also being done by different leaders, different managers, even different employees. So I hope that you're here and you can learn with us as well. Today, we are talking about intro to data-driven decision making. So just a quick introduction. Who am I? For those who are new here, you can call me Elisha, and I am a management consultant. I specialize in culture transformation, organizational development, and leadership development. I work with different organizations from very small companies here in the Philippines to multinationals with different offices around the world. The way that I think about my journey as a consultant, a lot of the theory and foundations really came from my time in school. After my undergrad here in the Philippines, in UP Diliman, I went to the US and did my master's in human resources and labor relations at Michigan State University. So you'll see these are my batchmates, very small class. A lot of the things I learned there were about using data, using frameworks to be able to get to the sound decisions that organizations need. So I'll be sharing some of those theories, some of those concepts with you today. After my time in my master's, I worked at Microsoft in their headquarters. I lived in Seattle, Washington for a few years as part of the global learning and development team. Over there in Microsoft, I was very lucky because I worked very heavily with the business analytics, data analytics team. In Microsoft, there's a dedicated team in HR called HR Business Insights. And what they do is they really just analyze data that will be relevant for different people related decisions. I worked closely with them and got to see firsthand how important it is for companies to have good data and not just good data, but to have people who can really utilize those to form insights. So, some of the processes and frameworks I'll share with you today, I also learned from my time in Microsoft. In 2018, late 2018, I came back home to the Philippines and started my own consulting practice. The consulting firm is just Elisha Corpus Consulting, so it's just my name. And like what I mentioned earlier, we work with different organizations from private companies to nonprofits, government, etc. An example of a client engagement that I have that uses a lot of data is my project with the LGU of Iloilo. So this year, I've been doing a project with the local government unit of the city of Iloilo, and we are doing a culture transformation initiative. We started that with a survey of almost 2,000 employees of the LGU. And then we went there to Iloilo for some interviews, focus group discussions, and analyzed all of that data to form recommendations. That's a concrete example of how important being data driven can be. And I'm looking forward to sharing those insights with you. All right. So what are we going to do this morning? In this webinar, we will discuss what it means to be data driven, especially at work. We are also going to discuss very, very basic statistical concepts that we can apply at work. And of course, we're going to identify strategies that we can use as we approach our work in a more data-driven way. Just a quick disclaimer for all of you. As you probably saw in the title of our session, it says Intro to Data-Driven Decision Making. So please just note that we're not going to do a lot of practice today because this is just an intro level webinar. It's not an intensive workshop where we will actually dig into data sets and practice the statistical analyses that we will mention. But the goal of our session today is to just to get you an overview of the importance of being data-driven and how you can infuse that kind of mindset in your everyday work. So again, this is not an intensive course on data analysis for HR, but it's an overview that hopefully can get you started. And with that, let's jump right into it and let's look at yung Mentimeter natin. So in the Mentimeter, the second question was asking you, what does being data-driven mean for you? So let's look at some of the answers here. People said thinking rationally, it's being reliant to proven information, collecting and analyzing data. Don't worry if you said, I don't know who, that's why we're here and we're all together. So no worries about that. Okay. Someone said factual, black and white. So let's see as we learn today if that's something that will really hold. If being data-driven really means everything is black and white and it's all right or wrong. All right? So it relies on information gathered in order to be motivated or to accomplish a task, relying on hard facts and numbers, using quantitative actual numbers, facts and figures. Okay, so a lot of people are kind of saying the same things, right? It's being critical, being objective, looking at hard facts, quote unquote hard facts. So we could look at black and white information. So parts of that you'll see apply, but some parts maybe we can question a little bit. So let's see, what does being data-driven mean? I invite you to, in your own space there, read along as I read the definition para pagka binabasa natin yung definition, mas na embed siya sa brain natin. So I invite you to do that in your own space, all right? So what is being data-driven? Being data-driven means making organizational decisions based on relevant and carefully thought out information rather than using intuition or observation alone. Keyword there in yellow, relevant and carefully thought out information. A lot of you said that as well. It's being critical. It's carefully thinking through something. But I think that's what I want to point out. Being data-driven doesn't automatically guarantee that your data is all correct, that your data is the most factual data out there. It's just that being data-driven means you've put enough time and enough effort to really look at the most relevant data that you can find and to think through it in the most rational, process-based way that you possibly can. So again, being data-driven does not ensure objectivity. It does not ensure that everything you analyze will be the correct answer, quote unquote, but it is about saying that whatever result comes up from my analysis, I know that these are from the most relevant and the most carefully thought out information. So that's what we mean by being data-driven. Now, if we look at data-driven decision-making at work, that involves having an understanding of the organization's priorities. So bakit ba kailangan natin maging data-driven? Dahil may goal yung kumpanya. To help that company to achieve its goal, we have to use the data that we can collect to see how we can reach those goals. So that's really the best way we can put it. Data-driven decision-making at work has to be aligned with the priorities of the organization. Data-driven decision-making at work is about gathering data and forming insights. Ang madaming tao, especially when we're so busy at work, ang nangyayari is we gather a lot of data. From my experience with clients, I see that a lot of organizations have a lot of data. Madaming pa survey, madaming pa interview, discussion, etc. But the problem is it's not being formed into insights. No one is analyzing that data to create insights from them that can be used for decisions. Kapag ganun, na hindi na-analyze yung data, then hindi pa rin fully data-driven yung organization ninyo. So very important that gathering data and forming insights go hand in hand. Data-driven decision-making at work is about managing the realities of the organization as you leverage the insights to make an impact. When it comes to being data-driven, it's not about black and white na kapag ito yung sinabi ng data, dapat yun na yung susundin. You have to also balance that with the realities of the organization and the people in it. If we think about situations when employees may be having a hard time at work, or there are lots of stories about consultants na hindi nakakasundo ng employees. Sometimes we hear about that. It's because maybe the consultant or the leaders, the data says they should, for example, maybe the data says they should just fire 20% of the workforce para makatipid, para hindi bumaba yung kita nila for that year. But even if that's what the data is saying, they can't just do that immediately. You have to balance that and manage the reality that you're dealing with people. So data-driven decision-making is about taking that data into account and also looking at what are the nuances of the context that I am in. How do I use the data to understand the reality and to make the best decision possible that will have the best impact to my organization and the people in it. So yun siguro yung nuance na pwede natin isipin when it comes to being data-driven. It's not as black and white because that data has to be used in accordance with the reality that you're in. So if we think about what are the benefits of being data-driven, maraming benefits. For example, if you're data-driven, you become a trusted advisor to the leaders in the company. Leaders usually want to make sure that you're acting with data because that tells them that you didn't just pull your solution out from scratch. It makes them feel more comfortable that your suggestion is coming from sound sources. So again, the benefit of being data-driven is it makes you a trusted advisor in your organization. Another benefit of being data-driven is it helps you to be more competitive in the marketplace. Because if you're using data that's available in your industry, then you can kind of tell that that's also the benchmark that other companies who may be your competitors are using as well. Another benefit is if we use data, then more likely there's a reduction in the bias that could affect our workplace. So if there's less bias, then we are helping promote a more inclusive workplace. These are just some of the benefits, but I don't want to focus on the benefits because at this point, I think a lot of companies already know how important it is to be data driven. In fact, if we look at research from WEF or World Economic Forum in 2023, they had a research on the future of jobs, and they were able to see that cognitive skills, meaning analytical and creative thinking, these are the top skills in demand for 2023. So ibig sabihin, these days, hindi na natin kailangan i-argue masyado na importante maging data-driven because it seems like for the most part, marami ng kumpanya ang naniniwala na dapat may data tayong ginagamit before we jump into conclusions and before we make decisions. But I'm sure, as you all know, it's easier said than done. We know being data-driven is important, but we have a hard time doing it. So what makes it hard to be data-driven? What usually blocks us from data-driven decision-making? Also, data-driven decision-making is very long, so I'll just summarize it sometimes as DDDM, okay? So if you hear that, I just mean data-driven decision-making. Let's look at what makes it hard, what makes it challenging for us. First, we don't know where to start. Sino nakaka-relate? Maybe you can give me a reaction, like a thumbs up or a heart kung nakaka-relate kayo. Usually daw pag sinasabing data-driven, iniisip na agad ng mga tao, ay, may math yan, nakatakot yan. Ibig sabihin pag data-driven, may numbers. So that's overwhelming. If you can relate, maybe you can give me a little thumbs up or a heart reaction. For sure, like math is not my cup of tea, even in school. So kahit ako, when you say data-driven, I get really overwhelmed sometimes and I don't know where to start. So that blocks us from having that approach in the workplace. Another challenge is we don't have enough time. So I'm sure kayo din in the work that you do, there's way too many things going on and you don't have enough time to sit down and sift through the data. Yeah, like what we have there in the chat, diba? Masyadong maraming data and wala kang time to look through all of that and to do the kind of focused work that needs to happen for data analysis. Pag data analysis, kailangan walang nanggugulo, di ba? Uupuan mo siya, titingnan mo siya in detail. And the reality of the workplace is that doesn't always happen. We don't always have quiet time. Another thing that may be blocking us from DDDM is we don't have foundational knowledge. For a lot of us, so wag na tayo mag-age reveal, but for a lot of us, it's been a while since we've been in school, right? So I'm sure nakalimutan na natin yung mga basic statistics that we learned in college. And so mahirap na siyang i-apply kapag matagal na siyang hindi ginagamit. For me, I'm lucky because this is my work and I get to practice it a lot. But for a lot of HR professionals out there na hindi lang consulting yung ginagawa ninyo, I'm sure that sometimes you've forgotten these basic statistical concepts and ideas. And so it's hard to do data analysis when you've forgotten how to do that. If these are the blockers that could stop us from having a data-driven approach, ano yung mga pwede natin gawin? Let's look at the flip side. If we don't know where to start, that means kailangan siguro natin ng some sort of framework to guide us on where we can start and what are the different steps that we can take. If we don't have enough time, having a set of common questions to use as basis will help. because we don't have to think about it for a longer period. If we have these common questions, we can pull them out of our brains easily. If we do not have foundational knowledge, then having a refresher on some of the basic concepts could be a starting point. Ito yung mga gagawin natin for our webinar today. We're going to look at a framework, some common questions, and some basic concepts. Again, we are not going to have an intensive workshop on data analysis because this is an introductory webinar. But my hope is that you'll get the language that you need so that you can further your research. Kapag hindi kasi natin alam kung anong hahanapin, it's harder to study it on our own. So my goal for you today is to be able to identify what it is that you would need to research more on or maybe to take a course on in the future, and just use our webinar today as the starting point. All right, so let's jump into a guiding framework. I'm going to show you the full framework first. As you'll notice, naka-watermark siya because this is actually the framework that we use in our intensive data analysis classes, even with our clients. So I'm going to share the framework with you today, but again, we're not going to cover it step by step as carefully as possible because that'll take 2 days even to just go through that whole process. So let's look at this framework, the data-driven decision-making approach. It starts with asking questions. Any scientific inquiry starts with that curiosity. Dapat nakikita natin kung ano yung nasa paligid natin, and we have that curiosity that will make us ask, bakit yan yung nangyayari? What is happening there? Why did you say that? What is the behavior that people are doing? So these are the kinds of questions we need to be asking ourselves as we look at the people and the environment around us. It starts with asking questions. Once we know the questions that we want to answer, being data-driven means we have to be intentional with planning. Hindi pwedeng bara-bara lang or kung ano-ano lang. Dapat meron tayong process para mas maayos yung pag-go natin from question to decisions. Of course, once you have that plan, you need to be able to gather and validate data that you will use to answer your initial questions. Once you have that data, you have to analyze it and interpret that so you can form insights. It's a cycle. So you go from asking questions to analyzing the data that could answer the questions. But in a lot of cases, once you have insights from the analysis, it pays off to be curious again. Dapat babalikan mo yung mga tanong mo. Nasagot na ba lahat ng tanong? Meron ba akong additional na tanong na kailangan ko pang tanungin? Are there other questions or other topics that are branching out from this? So it also helps to go back. That's why there's an arrow there going back. Now, in companies, just using that scientific process. This is the scientific method, by the way, if you remember your lessons from grade school. So etong process na yan, that's the scientific method. But that's not enough for companies. As working adults, now that we're professionals, or for the students here who will be professionals in the future, you have to be able to communicate your insights with other people in your organization. Kung hindi mo mako-communicate yung insights, useless siya. So we have to be able to clarify those recommendations and know how to present it with impact. Being data-driven in organizations means you also understand your audience enough so that you can show them the data that they need to make the right decisions that they need to make for the organization. So, of course, even after we've presented our data with impact, we have to be curious and go back to our questions to see, is there something I can improve? Is there something that changed? What are the conditions that I have to take note of now that I know this full cycle? So everyone, this is the guiding framework that you can use so you can start having a data-driven approach to your work. For today, we are going to cover the first 4. Ask questions up to analyzing and interpreting data. So yan yung bibigyan natin ng mas detail pa. Before I jump into the asking questions part, let me know, everyone, how are you all doing? Ready to move on, or are there pressing questions so far? Give me a thumbs up if you're ready to move on. And then if you have a question, of course, just type it in the chat or unmute. All right, thumbs up tayo kung ready mag-move on. Perfect. Sige, so parang maraming nag-thumbs up. So let's move into the first part of the framework, which is ask questions. When it comes to asking questions, we have to clarify the issue or the issues. Usually, issues or requests, they just arrive at our email, di ba? So usually, ibibigay siya ng boss natin or ng coworker natin or ng client partner organization natin. So when these requests or questions come in, before we immediately jump into answering them, we have to trace the information available so far. Really try to take a step back before we panic, di ba, na shucks, ano to, bagong trabaho. So we have to take a step back and ask ourselves, what is this question? Where did it come from and from whom? Galing ba sa ang department yan? Galing kanino? Is it from the head of sales? Is it from a person in marketing? Is it from your factory manager in a factory outside of Metro Manila? So really think about that because that gives you background on the issue at hand. It could give you a better sense of ano ba yung hinahanap nitong taong to? Ano ba itong issue? Saan ba siya nanggaling? Bakit ba siya tinatanong? So it really pays off to take a step back so you can understand that question better. Before you panic, so okay naman mag-panic dahil may bagong trabaho or may bagong question, but siguro after the micro panic or before the full-on panic, we could really take a step back to also understand the scope and limitations. Try to ask yourself, given my role and position in this company, what can I realistically do with this issue? Am I the person who can give the data? If hindi kasama sa role ko yung pag-collect ng data na yon, kaninong role yung nagko-collect ng data na yon? Can I connect with that person so I can gather the data needed to answer this question? Who is in charge of solving that? Kaninong accountability yung issue na to? It pays to understand that because you have to look at the system as a whole. When you're an individual in an organization, di ba, hindi lang naman ikaw yung gagawa nung solution na yun. Even if you're the one answering the question, later on, may iba pang tao na ma-involve. So it pays off to think through that bigger picture before you start taking action and diving into panic mode. Taking that step back will allow you to find out who will eventually make those decisions and then maybe start getting their buy-in, start getting their engagement as early as possible. So for example, with our engagement in the Iloilo LGU, the project is about culture transformation. So of course, we had to look at what the employees are saying and what the current reality is like for the employees. But in any organization, the decision makers are the highest level leaders. So we have to make sure that as we go through the process, we're bringing those higher level leaders along para naiintindihan nila kung ano yung nangyayari, bakit tayo nagtatanong sa mga employees, bakit tayo kumukuha ng data, so that we can dig into the concerns more. So doing that can help your project go more smoothly down the line. Okay, so asking questions involves clarifying the issues. It's also about understanding business alignment. Remember that if you're working in an organization, that organization will have higher level mission, vision, purpose, and values. So you want to make sure that you understand bakit importante itong questions na tinatanong sa'yo or questions na tinatanong mo given the company's identity. How are these questions connected to the mission, vision, purpose, and values of our company? We also have to be aware of the team's and the organization's priorities. Looking at the questions given to you, you have to be able to justify if these are important given the priorities. As HR professionals and as managers even, I'm sure you understand na madaming hinihingi palagi yung kumpanya. There are so many demands from people like you. So to be able to prioritize, you have to be able to say that, okay, I am going to have a data-driven approach for this question because it's related to the team's priority number one. Siguro yung isang question na sinend, hindi siya gaanong priority based on the goals of the group. So then the data gathering for that can happen in 3 months. It really helps you to prioritize what you will invest time and effort on in terms of data gathering if you understand the goals of the team and the organization. Now, another part of being able to ask questions is understanding the context of whatever data is presented to you. When we're given requests or questions, usually the people giving those requests or asking those questions have some sort of reference. When we have that reference, whether it's a study, a journal article, a news article, a magazine article, whatever it might be, we have to be able to evaluate the applicability of that study to our organization's context before we start applying it and jumping to conclusions. Ang nangyayari kasi, and I see this with a lot of companies, whether big or small, private or non-profit. Dahil, di ba, these days, madali nang mag-research. We have Google, we have Bing, we have ChatGPT, TikTok. TikTok even, di ba, maraming content creators sa TikTok. So these days, because maraming information ang nakukuha ng mga tao, sometimes it's tempting to just say, oy, nakita ko to, ito daw yung effective sa workplace. Try natin. It's tempting to do it because if it's popular everywhere else, you might think that, oh, it would work in our company as well. But we have to take a step back and understand first, will that be applicable to the specific situation that my company is in? What I'm going to do now is I'm going to share with you some sample questions that you can ask yourself, you can ask your teammates, you can ask your leaders if you're given some sort of data or study that they want to apply in your company. First, ask about the what. So kailangan tatanungin niyo sila. Yung study na yan that you're telling me to apply, or yung research na yan that you're saying is good, what are the objectives of that study? Does it align with the objectives of our organization? It doesn't necessarily mean that you only use research with the exact same objectives as your company. Imposible kasi yun. Companies are quite unique, and even two companies in the same industry may have different objectives. So we're not saying here that the objectives of the study and your company have to be the same. It's just that you have to understand kung bakit nila ginawa yung study so you can get the intent. And then from there, you can use your judgment to see if it's something that will help further your own company's objectives or not. That's where the decision making will come into play. Hindi siya black and white, di ba? Because it'll be very hard to find something that's exactly the same. So what we want to do here is to say, I've analyzed it enough. I've looked at the objectives of that study enough, and I understand the differences and similarities enough to apply it to our own company. That's the what. In terms of the why, look for the rationale of the study. It's good to try to look at journal articles. Kasi if it's journal articles, then more likely it's peer-reviewed. What does that mean? When it's peer-reviewed, ibig sabihin, iba-ibang researchers, iba-ibang scientists and social scientists ang nagbasa ng article na yon bago siya na-publish. That means they validated it, that the method is sound, that the results seem to make sense. That's the difference of a journal article with, let's say, just a random article that you find in a magazine or online. Kasi yung mga yun, hindi siya peer-reviewed. So now the question is, where do I find journal articles if you don't have access to a library or anything like that? You could go to Google Scholar. Okay, so I'm typing that in the chat. You can go to Google Scholar and let me get the actual website for you so it's easier, okay? So if you go to Google Scholar, you can use that to research journal articles. Of course, not everything is free. That's the reality of our time now, di ba? But honestly, madami-dami din naman yung reliable sources on Google Scholar that are free journal articles. So I would highly, highly suggest that you start using that as well so you can get journal articles and the references for your research. All right? Next question is who? So kailangan titingnan natin this study that I'm being told to use, who are the researchers? Is the institution credible enough? If you look at journal articles, you can see the names of the authors there and what university they are affiliated with. You have to take the extra step to research. At maayos ba na school yan? research nyo yung tao. So type nyo sa Google or sa LinkedIn yung name ng researcher just to see if these are people who really know what they're talking about. The sad reality is there are some journal articles that are not as reliable as others. So kailangan maging mas smart tayo in terms of looking at where the data is coming from. Same as what you see online, diba? Not all of the content creators on Facebook or TikTok will give reliable information. So we have to really ask ourselves, is this coming from a source that is credible enough to be talking about these things? All right. Another thing to ask is, if you look at the study, dig into who are the participants. Yung mga participants ba na sinurvey or in-interview or finocus group or in-observe, pwede ba siyang applicable dun sa kind of people in your company or your own organization? Now, another thing to look at is also sample size. So sample size means ito yung number of people that they surveyed or the number of people that they included in the focus group discussion or in the interviews. Usually, if you look at journal articles, sample sizes will be indicated as N equals. Okay, I typed it in the chat. So for example, if I surveyed 1,500 people, you're going to see in the article that it says N equals 1,500. Ibig sabihin nun, 1,500 ang nagsagot nung survey. That's the sample size. Okay? When it comes to statistical analysis, usually ang recommendation is 30, a sample size of 30 is safe. Okay, but let me explain because it gets trickier. Statistical analysis says that if the sample size is 30, that means that the central limit theorem applies. Meaning, medyo mas confident tayo na may bell curve na makukuha and statistical tests will work with the data set. So all they're saying is 30 seems to be a good enough number of people to get a reliable result from running statistical tests. Now, I've seen some people in the applied sciences, so mga HR for example, na ang interpretation nila doon is 30, okay na. Hindi na tayo maghahanap ng iba. So I'm going to challenge you now because 30 is just a recommended minimum. The more data you have, the better representation you will get from the population that you're targeting. So for example, if the number of employees in a company is 2,000 people, mas reliable yung data kung 1,500 ang sample size versus 30. Okay? So kung kaya, do more. Get more data, get a bigger sample size. But, as we all know, the reality is it's not always that easy to get big sample sizes. So sometimes, if that's the case, then statistics is telling us that if maka-30 ka at least may confidence tayo kahit konti na relevant at significant yung results na makukuha natin. Alright? So, again, bigger is we can be more confident that the results are applicable to our target population, but given the realities of the workplace, 30 is the minimum that we want to target. Now, there's another layer to this nuance, okay? So again, it's very hard to say in a black and white, even statistics, because there's a nuance to this as well. There are some cases when you really don't have 30, diba? If you don't have 30 people, then what do you do? For example, when I was studying in my master's, I was the only Southeast Asian. So if someone were to make a study that targets Southeast Asian people in the HR course, it's a sample size of 1 kasi ako lang. So what can we do as the researcher? In that case, babawiin mo yung small sample size with the depth of the data that you can collect. So what the researcher can then do is say, look, it's a sample size that's less than 30, but we had in-depth discussions with this target population. I have 5 people that I surveyed, konti lang sila, but to get a deeper analysis of what their perceptions are, we had 10 hours of interviews and discussions to get to a depth and familiarity. So that's a way to balance it if your sample size is small. You could also look at the depth of the data that you get. I have some questions here in the chat. Okay. Can we possibly identify individuals representing the majority of the population? It depends on the kind of sampling that you want, right? There are some cases when it's random sampling. And so you just have to look at how many people you have and ilang percent nun yung gusto mong i-target. If it's a specific sample that you're looking at, then it makes sense to get the representations. The difficulty about just getting the majority is you might lose the insights from the people in the edges that could also make your decisions more inclusive. In design thinking, we call that designing from the edge. Kasi nga, if you design for the people who are the most different, you also end up providing something that the majority can use. So I think it really depends on the research question. Sometimes it makes sense to just target specific people. Sometimes it makes sense that it's more random, so you can get a good range of ideas and opinions. Another question in the chat, I'll answer this one, then we'll move to the next. Pero pag may questions pa naman, I'll get to it later at the end. So just keep your questions there. I'll answer them as much as I can as we go through the slides, okay? The other question, 30 regardless of population size. So this is where the nuance comes in, right? So ang sabi is 30 can give you at least some confidence in knowing that you have enough to make the statistical tests work. But, of course, the bigger the sample size, then pwedeng mas ma-question kung 30 lang yung sample size mo. So, for example, if you have 50 people in the population and you have a sample size of 30, then medyo okay, di ba? Because more than half. But if you have a population size of 1,000 and you only targeted 30 people, then if I were the leader, my question is, bakit 30 lang? How can we be sure that they represent the population? Then you have to be able to justify that. Another layer to that is, depending on your research question, maybe it's really just this pool of people that you want to ask. So kung hindi talaga sila more than 30, and they're the kind of people that you need to ask based on the research question, then it doesn't make sense, right? To go beyond 30. So it depends, again, on the question that you're asking. That's why that's the first part of the framework. But short answer is, it's a good, parang medyo benchmark practice siya. You can think about it that way. It's a benchmark practice to have a sample size of 30, but it is not a hard and fast rule. It still depends on the question, the population, and the reality of what you're trying to study. All right, so hopefully we got those clarified. Next is where. We have to ask, where was the study conducted? Do they have similarities with the laws, policies, norms, culture of our company and the business environment that we are in? It also helps to ask, ito bang mga journal articles na gagamitin natin for reference? Is it comparable to the kind of environment we're in? If not, because honestly, a lot of research comes from the West, right? We have a lot of really, really good researchers here, but yung mga popular na nagiging ideas, realistically, they're from the US or from Europe. It doesn't mean that we cannot use those. What we're saying here is we have to think through those potential differences so that we don't jump into conclusions. We have to be aware of the differences and similarities so we can take that into account as we analyze the data and make our judgments. Next is when. You have to ask, when was the study conducted? Are the results time-bound, or do they show a fundamental idea that cuts across time? General rule of thumb, again, not a hard and fast rule, but when it comes to research, try na at least 10 years old lang siya or younger yung study mismo. Because things move really fast. So sometimes kapag more than 10 years na yung insights, it may not be applicable to the kind of business environment we're in. So not a rule again, but just a practice that you can think about. Look for research that's 10 years or more recent. Now, the nuance to that is there are some ideas that are more classic and fundamental, and it doesn't matter what era we're in, these things are pretty much shown to work. So you have to look at those concepts as well, because there are classic concepts that may be fundamental. It doesn't matter what year you're in. That means what we're saying here is you can still read through older studies beyond 10 years. Hindi naman useless yung research na yun. As you read through it, you just have to be smarter about thinking of what still applies now and what's a more fundamental idea that I could latch onto. Or maybe ano yung ideas doon na ano na siya, obsolete na siya. It's not something we can use nowadays. So it's a matter of reading it with a critical lens. Another question under when is, was the data obtained over a period of time or just one point in time? If it's over a period of time, we usually call that a longitudinal study. I'm typing it in the chat. A longitudinal study usually tracks the same set of participants across months or years. For example, there are some studies where from little kids as young as babies, they want to see if may effect ba yung pagpapalaki ng isang bata sa kind of adult that kid will be. So some researchers really track those kids from baby until they are 25, 30 years old. So those are longitudinal studies. Versus if it's just one point in time, these are usually called cross-sectional studies. And it's just observing what's happening in one specific situation. So it's good to look at what the study is trying to research so you can better understand kung bakit ganun yung results na nakuha nila. And then last thing that we can ask is how? How were the results obtained? What was the methodology or the methodologies used for the study? Look at it. Is it an experiment? So, nag-experiment ba sila? Ibig sabihin, pag experiment, may control group at may group na yun yung ginamitan nila ng variable. So, may isang group that did not change. They didn't put any interventions. And may isang group na nilagyan ng intervention. So, that's an experiment. Sometimes some people will say that experiments are the parang top of the line, na experiment is the best. Sure, experiments could be, very thorough, but it doesn't mean that only experiments should be used as reference. There are many, many different ways to gather data. Some people, it's more of observation. They don't need to do experiments. I had a teacher in my master's. Her expertise is compensation, and one of her lines of research was about compensation of female CEOs and how it relates with their communication style. So for her research, she didn't do an experiment. Mas nag-observe lang siya. Kinuha niya yung recorded calls of the shareholder meetings that these female CEOs had. She made a criteria for how to describe good communication, correlated that with their publicly available salaries, and that's how she did her study, which had very valid results as well. So again, hindi yun experiment, but it was still very useful in gathering data. So again, we just have to understand what was the methodology so we can describe that and take that into account before we jump into applying those results to our own company. These things are just sample questions that you can ask yourself, ask your teammates, ask your leaders when there's a request to apply something that's from a study or from a research or whatnot. Kailangan, iniisip muna natin kung talaga bang tama siya for our specific situation. So, let's do a quick example, everyone. Let's say your boss tells you this morning that they heard in the news that a 4-day work week is effective for worker retention. They want you to implement this in the company. What would you do? So, syempre, ang gusto natin, yes kagad, di ba? Kasi masaya yan. But, if we were to have a data-driven approach, what would we do? So, I'm putting up the slide here in front. Gawin natin siya together. Can you give me examples in the chat? What is a what question that we may ask if we want to have a data-driven approach to the scenario that I just mentioned? I-paste ko yung scenario in the chat, okay? So everyone can see. All right, what is a what question that we can ask? Let's type it in the chat. I'll give you a few minutes to do that. Pwede, yeah, di ba? So, yung question, is this applicable for the company? So, ibig sabihin, gusto mo malaman what industries were researched. Pwede rin, what is the current work schedule of our company? Swak ba siya dun sa dataset na sinasabi niyong gamitin? Good job. Okay, etong next one in the chat from Mirna. Ayan yung what will be the reason? Pwede rin siyang nasa why, di ba? Kasi pwede natin tanungin, what will be the reason for implementing this? My favorite question that I ask my clients is, why now? So for example, di ba, kung interested ka na mag 4-day work week, why now? Why does it work for your company now? What makes now a significant time? Then it really brings up a lot of the rationale. Okay, pwede rin. So what laws, what are the pros and cons? So these are things that we can ask. When it comes to who, what are some who questions that you think? Yeah, perfect, diba? Who are the clients or who are the employees that may be affected? You can also ask, who were the participants in the original study? Tingin mo, pwede kaya may similarities ba sila sa employees natin? Baka naman yung mga study doon, tech workers, pero yung employees natin, manufacturing. Applicable ba? So these are questions we can ask. How about where? See, where questions? Yeah, what country, right? Perfect. Baka mamaya, yung country na yun, first world, may internet connection sa lahat ng probinsya. Paano tayo kung yung factory natin outside Metro Manila in the middle of a field na walang internet? So how will we do that, di ba? So pwede natin tanungin yun. When? Any when questions? Examples? Yup. When will it be started and how long? Diba? Pwede rin na, when did they do the study? Baka naman mamaya, they did the study at the height of the pandemic when people were really not allowed to go to the office. So dapat alam natin yung context na yon. Great, everyone. Easy lang, di ba? Now, last one, how? How question. Yeah, how did they conduct the study? Perfect. And pwede rin, di ba? Oops. Let me copy that. How did they conduct the study? And how will we conduct the study? Perfect. So I hope you're starting to see the pattern here, di ba? You can use these questions in terms of looking at the reference study being presented to you, but you can also use them to ask questions about the implementation or the new study that will want to be done in your organization. All right, great, everyone. So it seems really easy, right? When we have time, when we're doing it together. The problem is, even though this is an easy exercise, because of the busyness of every day in organizations, kaya siya hindi nagagawa. Hindi siya nabibigyan ng time. And so my challenge for all of you is maybe you can be the ones who will encourage your companies to take a step back before doing something. Kayo yung mag-start ng discussion to ask these questions. All right, we spent a lot of time in asking questions because that is the bulk of it. If you know that you have the right questions you're going after, mas mabilis na yung iba. So let's go with the next one. Being intentional with the plan starts with forming your hypothesis. So what is a hypothesis? A hypothesis is an unproven idea or theory expressed as a statement that forms the basis for further organization or further investigation. To put it simply, hypothesis is the thing that you're going to test. Ito yung itatry natin i-figure out kung yes, tama yan, or no, mali yan. A good hypothesis has certain criteria. It's declarative in form. So you'll notice we started with asking questions because curiosity is through questions. But to have something that's testable, we need to write that question into a declarative form. Kasi pag declarative yung form, it's easier to say no or yes depending on the analysis. A good hypothesis is researchable. Ibig sabihin, may way to test it and to gather data about it. It's also stating the variables to be tested. I'm going to ask all of you, type it in the chat, left or right. Which one is a good hypothesis? Is it left? Working longer hours is the biggest factor influencing employee well-being during the pandemic? Or is it the right? Many factors influence employee well-being. Which one do you think is a better hypothesis? Good job, everyone. So, madali lang, di ba? It's the one on the left because it's testable and it shows the specific variable, which is longer work hours and employee well-being. The problem is people do not take time to write hypotheses. So that's my challenge for you. Take the time to write out your hypothesis first before gathering your data so that you know what it is that you're trying to prove or disprove. All right, next up, gather and validate data. When it comes to data, we want to be able to triangulate. The thing about our world, so HR, people practices, the thing about that is we deal with people and people are complex, which means we also need layers to the data that we will gather. Sometimes survey results are not enough because survey results, even if they're quantitative, kulang ng depth, di ba? Kasi hindi mo naman mapoprobe further yung tao. So gusto natin, may interview sana para makapag-probe tayo. Pero syempre, because people are biased for their own well-being and their own status and self-esteem, di ba? Alam naman natin yun na even the best of people, syempre may biases tayo. So we also want observations from the people around them, from the organization. If you use all three of these methods in your study, that means you've triangulated the data that you gathered and you can be more confident about it, okay? So, quick question for all of you. What are some possible challenges that you might encounter in gathering data? I know we said that triangulating is the best approach, ideally, but what might make it challenging to be able to triangulate your data? What do you think in your experience? What makes it difficult? Let's see. I'll give you a few. Yup. Time, respondents, availability. Hindi sumasagot yung mga tao, di ba? Sometimes we say a 40 to 60% response rate is actually quite good enough. Kasi nga, hindi ka makaka 100%. Yeah, low responses. 40 to 60% is okay na. So, di ba, mahirap kumuha ng data. So, let's look at what are some common sources of data that we can use in organizations. I love this picture because as funny as it sounds or as it looks na parang nagmamarites lang sila, in psikolohiyang Pilipino, there's actually a method called pagtatanong-tanong at pagkakwentuhan. And culturally, because Filipinos love to make tanong-tanong and to make kwento, that's why it's a very rich way daw to gather data kapag ka nagpapakwento ka sa mga tao ng buhay nila at ng thoughts and feelings nila. So the picture is funny, but I love it because I think it's such a fun way to put the reality into perspective. And the thing about people data is it could already exist in your organization. This is just a reminder that you don't always have to start from scratch. You don't always have to get a new survey, because what if you can already use something that exists in your company? For example, a lot of companies will already have employee data. You know the average age of people that's in their employee data. You know how long they've been in the company, what level they are. You can also use, a lot of companies already have culture surveys, satisfaction surveys, yearly morale surveys. Maybe there are items there that could help answer the questions you asked. So you could use that. Telemetry data means these are things like website visits. For example, you can look at ilang tao na ang nag-view nung email sinend mo or nung document na pinost mo. That's an example of telemetry data. It's not something you have to gather through a survey. It's already there based on the website visits or website views. You could look at business-specific surveys as well, like supply data, inventory. These can tell you more about the performance of the people or the group that you're trying to study. So again, this is just a reminder that we don't always have to start from scratch. We have to be creative about where we can find our data, because it's very challenging to get respondents, very challenging to find time, very challenging to make an effort to gather data. So kailangan titingnan natin kung ano yung meron na tayo. And of course, always remember that pakikipagkwentuhan, having that relationship where people can trust you to talk about what is going on and their thoughts, that is also very, very valuable. And then next up is analyze and interpret data. Once you get that data, one of my biggest tips for all of you is it would be really, really useful as an HR professional to invest in basic statistics. So there are lots of videos that you can watch online. I was searching last night and I saw this course in Udemy. It's not free, I think, but there's parang mas may discount yata siya eh. Parang mas mura siya than usual. I don't know if it applies to you as well. So you could check that out. I looked at the curriculum of that course and it looks pretty complete. Disclaimer, I haven't done that course myself, but I looked at the curriculum and parang okay siya. So if you're interested, my recommendation is to do a basic statistics course para talagang mas maintindihan natin kung paano mag-analyze ng data and use statistics in that way. So that's just a suggestion. The link I sent, of course, you don't have to take Udemy. Hindi naman ako nagpro-promote. But if you can look in the internet, look for ways that you can study, the better. So because this is not an intensive workshop, I'm just going to walk you through a concept that is very useful and prevalent. Correlation versus causation. A lot of us know that they're not the same, but when we're in companies and dealing with so much data with not enough time, we tend to jump into conclusions that they are the same. So let's differentiate. Correlation indicates a relationship between variables in a specific direction. Ang sinasabi lang ng correlation is, pag nagbago yung isa, magbabago din yung isa. Pwedeng parehong tataas, parehong bababa, tataas yung isa, bababa yung isa. But correlation doesn't say why. Correlation doesn't say that this is changing because of the other. That is causation. Causation implies that changes in one variable creates changes in another. So, ang causation is, pag tumaas yung isa, ito yung rason kaya tataas din yung isa. Or bumaba yung isa, and sure tayo na ito yung rason kaya bumaba yung isa. So that's the difference there. To visualize it, this might be better actually than just listening to me. So the visual there on the slide, that tells us that correlation doesn't always imply causation, but causation suggests that they are correlated. Okay? Ibig sabihin, kapag may causation yung dalawang variables, we can say na related sila. Pero kapag ang dalawang variables ay related, they're correlated, we cannot immediately say that there's a causation between them. All right? Let's try an example because it might be easier this way. Without statistical testing, is it correct to use an arrow indicating that variable X caused variable Y? Yes or no? Let me know in the chat. Is this correct that we haven't done statistical testing yet? But what this is saying is a decrease in work days to 4 days in a week leads to decreased resignations? No, right? So tama. They may be correlated, but we cannot say with the arrow that variable X is causing variable Y. Bakit? What do you think, everyone? What might be other variables that could lead to a decrease in resignations? What other reasons could lead to that? Yeah, good ER programs. Higher salary, job satisfaction, increased benefits. Perfect, di ba? So madaming ibang reason. Pwedeng pumayag mag-work from home ng more than 1 day. Increased vacation. Pwedeng natanggal kasi yung mga leader na hindi natin gusto eh. Kaya magsistay na lang ako. Wala na naman yung boss na ayaw ko, di ba? So, there are many reasons. And we don't know which one is impacting variable Y. Pwedeng lahat. Pwedeng lahat, pero may isang pinaka. And we can only answer that if we do statistical analysis on these factors. That's why it's important that we can apply those. All right, so that's the reason for wanting to apply statistics in these scenarios. But again, we don't have time to dig into that, but this is just an example that shows us, di ba, kung gaano ka-importante yung ganong deeper testing. Even just coming up with these variables, that's already very important for your organization. But to take your skill further, to be an even more impactful HR professional, it'll be good to be able to say which one of these factors is the most important in decreasing resignations, so you can double down on that. And with that, everyone, that is actually it for the things that we will discuss in detail. Like what I said, after you analyze and interpret your data, it's good to go back to your questions to see, nasagot ba yung things that we're curious about? Did the hypothesis that was proven or disproven satisfy the questions and the concerns that are being asked of me? As you go through that, you also have to think about, okay, ano yung recommendation ko based on my data? Hindi pwedeng puro data lang and insights. Dapat may concrete akong masasuggest so it can be useful to the company. And then once you know your recommendations, how do I present that in an impactful way that will make decision makers realize how important this is? So you present with impact. And then, of course, as an organization, it's good to go back to the issues and concerns to see, are these decisions that we're making satisfying those concerns and initial questions that came up in the first place? If we go through that cycle, This is creating a culture in your company that's not just data-driven, but also a learning culture. Kasi nga, mas open na yung mga tao sa pagtatanong, mas open na yung mga tao sa pag-analyze ng data at pag-prove or disprove ng mga hypothesis before jumping to conclusions. So today, we went through a guiding framework. So we got that. We went through common questions. We have that table that we went through and we practiced with. We looked into basic concepts that you can use as a starting point. For example, of those basic concepts are a good hypothesis and the criteria for that, and also correlations versus causations. So everyone, now that we have done all of the things that we mentioned in our objectives, to close up, and before I give you the instructions for the certificate, last question. What will you keep in mind from today's learning session? If there's just one thing that you would remember, what is that? And then for the people who sent in questions, we usually do our Q&A later. So we let people go. If they don't have any more questions, then the ones who have questions are the ones who stay. All right? Thank you so much. I'm keeping track of your questions. Okay. Let's see, everyone. One phrase, one word, one sentence. What will you keep in mind from today's learning session? Yeah, not all data are relevant. Exactly. You have to be able to be smart about what data to use para hindi rin sayang yung effort natin. Perfect. Thank you so much for that. Being data-driven is process. Yes. Diba? Data in itself is just information, but it's the process of being data-driven that gets that into insight. Correct? Okay? Data should be carefully interpreted. Validating data is important. Be clear with the purpose exactly, because asking those questions, that's the first step. That will dictate kung sino yung target sample size, sino yung population, sinong i-interview. Research before deciding, validate, yes, be selective. Great, it's not as black and white. Diba? Minsan, sinasabi ng mga tao, yan yung sinabi ng data eh. So, wala kang karapatan magreklamo. Or, well, kahit na masama yan for people, ayan yung sinasabi ng data. That's not being truly data-driven, because remember what we said, being data-driven is also about looking at how it aligns with the company's mission, vision, purpose, values, and how it aligns with the reality. So, perfect. I'm glad you got that. You're more credible as HR if you are data-driven. Yes. Cognitive skills. Data-driven is not drama-driven. Yes. Interpretation of data should be aligned, validating data thoroughly. Perfect, everyone. So keep it going if you have any more insights. But with that, thank you all so much. Let me give you the final instructions for the e-certificate. Okay, so here we go. First off, please do connect with us, Elisha Corpus Consulting on Facebook. And if you have a minute or two to spare, please leave a review. We would totally appreciate it if you could leave a review for us. For the people who were with us last Pride Month, you know why. In summary, because we also do a lot of content on diversity, equity, and inclusion, nung Pride Month, maraming anti-DEI who left negative reviews on our page. So we would appreciate if you can help us get those reviews back up. Next up, if you're going to be in PSTD or Philippine Society for Talent Development Convention in person in Clark next week, please say hi. I'll be there Monday for my session. I have a session on onboarding, and then I'll be there the whole convention. So please, if you're there, say hi. I would love it if we could meet in person. And then, of course, if you want a certificate, a free e-certificate, please go ahead and do the form. So we are going to close the form at around 2 o'clock. So please answer that. We'll keep that open for 2 hours. And one last, please join us for future webinars. And if you'd like to work with us for your organization, please book a call with us to learn more about how we can partner with you. And with that, everyone, again, the form is in the chat. Thank you all so much for learning together with me. Thank you for your comments and your questions. If you don't have any more questions, this is the end of the session, so feel free to log out. And I will see you next month. Thank you so much for being here. Have a great week. But for those with questions, stick around and just type them in the chat. So I'm going to answer questions until we run out of questions. So just type it in the chat, everyone. Okay. So for those who are already leaving, thank you so much. Have a great lunch. Have a great lunch, everyone. And have a great rest of your week. Okay? Sa mga may question, I'm going to start answering them now. All right. Pwede rin mag-send ng direct message if ever you're shy or you want it to be more confidential. Okay. Let's start answering questions. Okay. So this person said, I always do employee like pulse checks. But my concern is my immediate leader interprets data in a manner that will just be beautiful to management. Okay. So parang my understanding is the way the data is interpreted is just all positive, no? Na parang it's just a way to show how things are working well, but it's not actually showing the reality. So that's my interpretation of what you're saying. So yeah, I mean, first of all, like I just want to validate that the situation you're in is so difficult. Like I totally understand that you're having a hard time because anyone in your position would be having a hard time. So siguro my suggestion is if you have like a good working relationship with that leader, it might be good to have a sit down with them first and really talk through about the value of the data that you're getting. So siguro the way I would approach that is by really looking at ano ba yung question na sinasagot na gusto natin sagutin nung data na to. If you have that question clarified, it might be worth it to present that to the leader again. You know, we don't want to judge, diba, kung bakit ginagawa yun yung leader. But maybe, if ever, baka nakalimutan na rin ni leader kung ano ba yung initial question or concern that you're trying to solve. So it pays off to remind them of that again. So that might be good. And then another thing I would bring up if I have that conversation with my leader is, so ano ba yung gusto natin na pwedeng mabago? What is in the scope of what we can change and what we can implement in the organization? Because maybe hindi lang kayo nagsisi eye to eye about the scope of possibilities. What do I mean by that? What if the leader is worried that if the real results or the negative results come out, hindi kakayanin ng company yung changes. So then it's a matter of assuring your leader that there's a way to scope it out. You can remind the leader that even if the results are huge and kind of big in scope, baka pwedeng ano ba yung pinaka-realistic for now na mabago based on that? What is something small we can work on using the data? Para hindi natin totally disregard the data that the employees gave, even if it's not as positive as what management wants. So maybe if I have a way to talk to the leader, that's how I would do it. That's on that side. And then siguro on a side that I will do individually, if ever, I'm going to, kind of also make my own analysis of the data, going through that, just so I can show my leader that, okay, like, if I validate and triangulate, diba, the more eyes, then you can kind of say na, mas madami ring nagtingin and mas marami tayong interpretations that we can use. So if you have your own analysis, then you can also be more confident in presenting that and showing a different perspective. So siguro, something I would do individually if I were in your shoes is I'll go back to my data, really tie up my question, have my hypothesis ready, try to analyze it as best I can so that when I go back to the leaders, I can show them a different perspective that the data might be showing. So siguro yun yung pwede gawin in the shorter term. Ideally though, in the longer term, we have to be able to show the leaders that data from employees is not about showing management that they're bad leaders. It's really just about looking at what is the reality they are going through and how can we bit by bit help mitigate that or ease that reality. So yun siguro yung mas long term na kailangan pa ma-appreciate nila more yung data-driven approach and its benefits in the organization. Super long answer, but again, it's first like really trying to have a conversation with the person. Second, individually doing your own data analysis as much as you can so you can have your confidence in your own analysis. And then the more long term is trying to build that culture where people understand what it means to be data driven and to have that approach. All right. I am scrolling up for questions. Wait lang, everyone. Okay, I see a question here. What are the common data-driven decision-making for HR? And then if the people here have some examples as well, feel free to write it in the chat. My understanding of your question is you're looking for what are some common ways that people in HR use data, no? Let me know if my understanding is correct, but that's my interpretation. So, pinaka madaling example and pinaka common example that I can think of is number one, like employee satisfaction surveys. People call it differently in different companies. Some say employee satisfaction. For some, it's culture survey, morale survey, climate survey, annual survey, whatever that might be. I think that's a very common data-driven thing that a lot of people in HR do. So you can do those surveys and then try to find a way to have an even stronger data-driven approach. So kung may survey na, baka you can suggest also having focus group discussions and interviews so you can supplement that and deepen your understanding of survey insights. So that's something that's common. Another thing that's common is, especially if you're a recruiter, you could use data-driven approaches there. Kasi, madali kumuha ng numbers. If you're a recruiter, you know how many people you're sending invites to, how many people you're ending up hiring, gaano katagal yung time that it takes from contact to hire or to offer accept. So usually in recruiting, you have a lot of data that's readily available. So if you have some questions that you can be curious about, some ways that you can improve processes in recruiting, maybe data is often easily available. So that's the second common way that I see it done. Third is also for people in compensation. So for people in compensation, because you are dealing with numbers already, then if you have questions about employee performance, like are you paying the right people well according to market, usually may data na yun. Kasi nga, nandun naman yung database of salaries, etc. So I hope that was the intent of the question there, to provide some examples of being data-driven. And then if, as participants, you have other examples of the ways you use data, please do share in the chat. All right. Let's go to other questions here. Hold on. Let me scroll questions. Okay. There we go. Question. Would it be better if data analysis is handled internally or outsourced? Specifically, if there's some concerns related to data privacy or security. Okay. So I would say this depends on the kind of study that you're doing and the capability of the people in the company to conduct that study. So for example, as a consultant, I usually come in when, number one, the HR people are not confident enough that they have the capability to conduct those surveys and to analyze it. So then for them, they think it's better to hire externally. Kasi nga, mas magastos pa if ititrain muna nila yung sarili nilang tao internally to be able to do that. Then the other decision factor, I guess, that they have is how confidential should it be, and how safe will people feel given the topic. When it comes to concerns like culture, workplace environment, usually that's why people hire someone external, because that's when an objective third party, quote unquote, could help create a safe space for people to talk about their realities and their experiences. So I would say it really, really depends on the topic. But for the most part, because the kinds of data analysis we do in HR relates to people, then what usually happens is, depending on the capability of HR, they decide if they would get someone inside or outside. Follow-up question. And what should be done if there's a conflict between data insights and expert judgment? Okay, really, really good question. If there's a conflict between the insights of the data and the people who are supposed to be judging that data, this is where the triangulation and validation from multiple assessors can really be of service. So you have to also make sure that the people who are analyzing the data and looking at the insights, making decisions from that, it's not just one or two people. Try to get as diverse of a group of decision makers as possible, so that there's more confidence that their decisions will be sound. So maybe that's one. And then another thing that you can, sorry, hold on. Yes, everyone, this is just Q&A for people with questions. So if you do not have any questions, please feel free to leave. Thank you so much for being here. Yes, okay. And then the other thing I was going to say is, if there's conflict between the data insights and the people who are supposed to be judging that, it would be good to get those people together, those expert judges together, and go back to the question. So that's why it's very, very important to start with the question and to document that question. And dapat lahat kayo nag-agree na yun yung tamang question before you proceed with the study. So what I usually do is kapag may conflict, I go back to say, this is the question we all agreed on when we started this study. So where is this conflict coming from? Are we interpreting the data in a way that will justify this original question? Tama ba yung proseso natin given the original question? Sometimes, a lot of times actually, people forget the original intent of why they started the research in the first place. So coming back to that and really clarifying that question helps. All right. Thank you so much. I don't know if I missed any questions. I'm scrolling up and I don't see any more questions. If I missed a question, please bring your question back up again, because right now I don't see any other questions. All right, but I'll give it a few more minutes, everyone. Again, thank you so much. Please make sure to do the form, and it's been great talking to all of you. Thank you for your questions and your sharing and your participation. Have a great rest of your week. And have a great rest of September. Nga pala, start of the month pa lang. Usually end of the month tayo nagwa-webinar. All right, everyone. I don't see any more questions, so I'm going to end the call now. Bye. Thank you all.